where today we're going to be discussing the nexus between our transition to a new, cleaner future powered by renewable energy technologies with mining, development, and conflict. Our global energy systems have long impacted our political and economic systems. Fossil fuels have helped drive global development, but at a significant cost to environmental, social, and geopolitical costs as well. Renewable energy systems underpin international efforts to turn away from fossil fuels and meet ambitious and shared global climate goals. But it's important to note that renewable energy technologies do require raw materials, most important of which are a collection of minerals such as lithium and cobalt, which we are collectively calling green energy minerals. And the growing demand for this set of minerals and their implications on security, on conflict, on development, on peace building. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And I am personally really looking forward to a lively and engaging discussion today on this topic. We have some truly amazing experts on the panel today, but we also want to benefit from all of the diverse voices and expertise in the room. And so with that in mind, I would like to ask everyone to please change your name in Zoom to include your affiliation. That would be really helpful. And also, if you feel comfortable, please introduce yourself to the room using the chat box so that we have an idea of who else is in the room with us today. My name is Kim Thompson. I work at the United States Agency for International Development. I'm a senior advisor on natural resources and conflict. And I'm really excited to be hosting the panel today. In terms of structure for the event today, we have about an hour and a half together. I will take a few minutes at the beginning to provide a framework for our discussion. Then I'll briefly introduce our esteemed set of panelists. And then each panelist will provide a few opening remarks, and then we're going to open it up for a discussion. And as people are entering their names into the chat box, I'm already excited by some of the names that I'm seeing. We certainly are going to have some great expertise in the room today. That's really exciting. And I am going to start by sharing a quick presentation, showing a few slides to introduce the topic. So today's session is called Minerals Behind Our Low Carbon Future, A Reason to Worry. And before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone on the call today. This is from NPACS. By registering and participating in this event, you're agreeing to abide by the anti-discrimination, harassment, and retaliation policies. There are a number of really important links today. This is going to be particularly important as we open it up to hopefully a lively discussion this afternoon, later today. So the reason why seemingly everyone right now, from the World Bank to the New York Times to my organization, USAID, are discussing green energy minerals is really quite simple. Our green energy future relies on mining, and a significant amount more mining. If we want things like electric vehicles and solar panels, we need a steady and reliable source of green energy minerals. And as we're speaking, several dozen minerals are currently starting to form the backbone of tomorrow's energy systems, and we need to be paying attention to these minerals. They're quite important for our future. So addressing the development challenges and the conflict challenges around the mining and building responsible supply chains is becoming more and more important. So the bottom line is we need to learn to mine better. We need to learn to mine smarter. We need to learn to mine cleaner, and we need to learn to mine fairer. And for all of these reasons, we're gathered here today to start to dig into some of these really, really important issues. And so just to lay out what we're talking about here, I just want to get all on the same page about sort of what kind of minerals we're talking about. There's a lot of different categories of minerals that get thrown around. And I put a few of them up here just to help visualize what we're talking about here. It is important to note that there is no single sort of global definition for a lot of these different categories. So this is just from, so the USAID perspective of what we're talking about here. There is a list of 35 minerals, which we call critical minerals. So that's sort of that big category right there. Those are sort of officially categorized, and the minerals that we're talking about today are specifically green energy minerals, which you see there's a huge overlap between critical minerals and green energy minerals. And that's really the takeaway of this slide here. The USAID recently went through a process of looking at green energy minerals for our purposes. We identified about 29 minerals that are used in green energy technologies and then whittled it down using various criteria to come up with sort of 16 minerals, which we thought were sort of the most important for our purposes. 11 of those overlap with critical minerals. And it's those green energy minerals that we're discussing today. And one of the reasons that we wanted to host this conversation is that green energy minerals and mining in this transition to a green energy future will have impacts on the developing world, and especially fragile and conflict affected environments. And we wanted to put the spotlight there and figure out how to discuss some of those tricky issues, how poor governance and conflict could threaten mineral supply chains and our conflict goals. Our climate goals, sorry about that. And dig into really important questions. I will note that USAID has recently produced a report that might be of interest to some of the people on this call. It is called Mining in the Green Energy Transition. It's about 125 pages long, and it has it really goes into depth into some of these conversations and maybe a useful resource for some of the folks on this call. It's available on Land Links. So this chart just shows a select set of those green energy minerals and how they're used in green energy technology. You can see that most of them are used in capturing that energy and sort of battery storage. And the percent increase that's estimated importantly under a 2-degree scenario rather than the more ambitious sort of global target of 1.5 degrees. So this is under a 2-degree scenario. What's our best guess for the amount of demand increase in demand that we would likely to see by 2050? And the takeaway is pretty simple, just that even with conservative estimates, global demand may increase of upwards of 500% by 2050. So we're talking about really significant increases in demand for these green energy minerals. This graphic is simply to show some of the geographic scope for where we would expect to see where some of these green energy minerals are currently being exported from. So this shows major mineral producers as of right now. It only shows the top 3 producers. So you can see, for instance, Democratic Republic of Congo is a top producer of cobalt, that Peru is a top producer of copper, silver, and zinc. The important thing to note here is that if we broaden the lens into just looking at countries, developing countries, so USAID presence countries that have green energy minerals, we're actually looking at about 70 USAID presence countries, so very widespread. There are a number of mining and development challenges currently associated with the mining of some of these green energy minerals. These are a few of the categories that we put in, that we highlighted in our report. They range from mining governance challenges to challenges on labors and working conditions, environment, conflict and human rights, land and property rights, and some issues of sort of local, national versus local economic development, sort of the distribution of benefits. What is important to note here is that although there is a category for conflict and human rights, a lot of these other categories, of course, influence conflict as well. And this next slide essentially shows some mining risks associated with each of the minerals. It's just illustrative at this. It doesn't show all of the minerals, but you can read the report if you're interested in diving into this. It's really just to show how the mining risks align with the different minerals in our literature review. And with that, I think that's enough to sort of frame the issues in terms of what we're talking about. Let me stop sharing my screen real quick. And the globe really, I think, has a lot to still learn in this space. And that's one of the reasons why conversations like this are really important. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the 4 panelists. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak today. And then I really look forward to a rich discussion. So first today, we'll hear from Professor Moises Arce, who Moises is the Scott and Marjorie Cohen Chair in Latin American Social Sciences and a professor in the Department of Political Science at Tulane University. Moises specializes in conflict processes in the politics of social and economic development. And he will talk to us today about his research on the roles of extractives in resource conflicts in the global South. And then next we'll hear from Joanne Liebert, who is the executive director at Impact, a nonprofit organization that focuses on how natural resources are managed in areas where security and human rights are at risk. And Joanne's work has focused on contributed to responsibly sourced conflict-free minerals, and she's helped Central African governments launch and implement a regional strategy to tackle conflict minerals. So Joanne will bring a practitioner's lens to our discussion and also ground our conversation by highlighting observations in the cobalt sector in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And next, we'll hear from Mike Jobbins, the Vice President of Global Affairs and Partnerships at Search for Common Ground, an international peacebuilding nonprofit has 60 offices and 1,000 staff throughout Africa, Asia, Europe, Middle East, and North America. Quite impressive. Mike will shift the conversation to discuss conflict sensitivity and other practical tools, including measuring social good and conflict in supply chains. And then the last word will go to Professor Benjamin Spatz, who will have the, so he's going to have the last word. Benjamin is a scholar practitioner focused on conflict, sanctions, corruption, and African politics. He's a fellow at the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and a co-director for the project Carbon Compacts, Decarbonization, and Peace in Fragile States. And he'll highlight some of the issues facing oil-producing countries. And then Kendra Dupuy has kindly agreed to be our first discussant to provide a few reflections to the presentations. She is a senior research fellow at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo, Norway, and a political scientist. And I'm really excited to have such an esteemed group of colleagues with me here today. And with that, I will pass it over to Professor Arce.
Great. Thank you, Kim. And I want to thank the host for organizing this event, as well as my fellow panelists and everyone attending the Zoom call. So what I'm going to share sort of like follows my research related to resource conflicts in Latin America in the context of the commodity boom. So roughly between 2002 to 2014. So we have information available that in a way tells us the increase in terms of environmental conflicts, and this information follows the Environmental Justice Atlas, which you can easily Google it and search this information. I'll be clear that the Environmental Justice Atlas is not a statistical sample, but it's more like a convenience sample, right? In the sense that it's telling you information that has been reported about several or various types of environmental conflicts. So just to highlight a few things. So you have an estimate more or less about 2,700 environmental conflicts. About 21% of them are actually related to mineral ores, right? And when you think about Latin America, you think about Mexico, Chile, and Peru. You think about silver, copper, and gold, right? As sort of like the main commodities that explain a lot of this variation when it comes to these resource conflicts. I wanted to clarify that sometimes when people use that language of conflict, you know, at least in the Latin American context, and this will be best described as more like low intensity, right? We're not talking about something that looks like a civil war or anything like that, right? There are a few cases where, you know, those conflicts end up in high violence, right? But in general, the type of conflicts that we're seeing can be best characterized or described as low intensity. So in this universe of conflicts, there's sort of like, you know, trying to understand this variation. And in some earlier work, I sort of like proposed just like a very basic typology, right? So like if you want to think about two broad categories of conflicts, right? So one of them is thinking about conflicts where rejection is the main motive, right? And in these conflicts, the driving motive is, so to speak, is a threat. It's because communities are seeking to defend water, land, or maybe cultural rights, right? Those demands are, if you want to call it, non-negotiable or intransigent, right? So meaning that those communities don't want mining or extraction under any circumstances, right? And typically, when you think about these conflicts of rejections, we're thinking about long campaigns, right? So one example that I was thinking about was Tia Maria, a copper concession in southern Peru, where actually the conflict goes back to 2009, right? And it's still ongoing, right? But on the other side, I'm sorry, before I move on, in the great majority of these conflicts, the conflict is going to be localized, right? It's going to be the district, it's going to be the community, right? But in some occasions, you do see how those conflicts scale up, right? Meaning that they will draw national actors, they will draw maybe international actors, right? So basically, that kind of tells you a little bit of the intensity of this conflict. On the other side, and this is actually the great majority of conflicts that are related to, at least on thinking about Latin America, are conflicts about redistribution, right? So this is the opposite of rejection, right? What you have here is, if you want to call it, is sort of like a positive motive or an opportunity, right? So one way to understand this is that, think about maybe it is true that in some areas rejection is just not possible, right? So the default becomes negotiation, right? So communities would like to negotiate their fair share of distribution of resource rents if rents are available, right? Or some form of direct compensation by the mining, the resource industry, or the mining industry, or maybe even the development of local projects in the community, right? So again, a lot of these conflicts on the redistribution side are low intensity, right? It's a little bit of negotiate, receive a concession, going back to protest, more concessions, and sort of like it continues, right? So unlike the other conflicts, thinking about rejection, we're thinking more about short-term campaigns or short duration. Now, the interesting thing about these two broad categories, rejection and redistribution, it has to do with its fluidity, right? In the sense that maybe at this moment, there's a campaign against extraction and it's close to rejection, right? But then rejection fails, and then the project begins, or the company begins extracting minerals. And now you have, if you want to call it, you enter a phase of a conflict related to redistribution, right? And then it could be that years later on, the company wants to expand, so to speak, to new lands, and then you come back to rejection, right? So you can go from rejection to redistribution, back to rejection, and so forth. So again, these are two broad categories, but it's actually fluid. Two more things I will highlight briefly. One of them is thinking about the commodity or the value change. And one way to think about this is this notion of the tipping point, right? So in the value chain, you think about the moment of concession, you think about the moment of extraction, you think about the moment of transportation, and so forth, right? So the big unknown in the literature is sort of like, why is it that some conflicts explode, so to speak, in the concession phase, whereas other conflicts explode in the extraction phase, right? And again, that's sort of like a little bit the unknown, right? So in this area, the concession is made, it looks like there's social peace, things are working great, but then years later, when the extraction begins, the conflict starts, right? So again, think about the commodity change. And the final point, and with this I'll finish, I think it's also important to think about how the conflicts are manifested in different areas, right? So I'll give you 4 examples. One example, you can think about the design of the project itself, right? That it could be that the sources of water are an issue, right? That maybe they're trying to use subsoil water and that competes with agriculture. Or it could be that we're talking about an open pit or an open cast project that will have a huge impact on the landscape, right? So it could be something about the design of the project itself where you're going to find the main source of contention, right? Or you can think about that there may be something at the community level, right? That are close to that, where the project is located, right? That there's something at the community that is not right, right? And the best example for this is when the community is being asked to be moved or relocated to another area to make room for the mine, right? Or another example would be what the literature talks about, mechanisms of participation. And here you can think about a continuum, right? Whereas on the one end, maybe the community is totally blindsided, right? That they are just not aware that a project is supposed to happen. And then following this continuum, you can get to the point where the community or the government gives the community some say in the development of the project, but it looks more like window dressing, right? It doesn't have real teeth, right? Or you can keep moving in the continuum that maybe there is room for communities to have a say in the project, but it's very limited, not necessarily about rejection, but more about negotiation. Next, you can also think about the companies themselves, right? And here, you know, in the literature, you can think about this problem of credible commitments, right? In the sense that it could be that a company has made promises for X number of jobs, but then the jobs are not being originated, or it could be that the company has made promises for compensation and those things have not been honored, right? So the fault, so to speak, is directly in terms of the company. And finally, you can think about how the dimension of the conflict can also be more closely related to the government, right? Because of corruption, or because of criminalization of protesters, or because actors maybe perceive the government as too close to the industry, right? They don't see the government necessarily as a third-party actor, right? So to conclude, again, think about these broad categories of conflicts. Some of them are rejection, but the majority of them are about redistribution. Also think about the tipping point, right? Why is it that some conflicts are manifested early in the early stages of the commodity change, where others are manifested later? And finally, thinking about where the manifestation of the conflicts themselves, right? Is it close to the design of the project? Is it close to the community? Is it close to the mining industry? Or is it close to the government? Okay. Thank you, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Arce. That's a really helpful way to frame the discussion, and I think those concepts will be helpful as we continue our discussion today. And next, I would like to pass it off to Joanne Liebert.
Great, thanks, Kim. I have a PowerPoint. Hopefully I won't go on too long, so don't be afraid to cut me off if you need me to wrap up. And the way I interpret here, conflict is very much as linked to very deep inequalities at a societal level, and how that could be a potential cause of conflict or a conflict risk, let's put it that way. And of course, I'm speaking to cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I'm not going to go on about our organization. I encourage you to check out our website, but just to say that we've been involved in the cobalt space, in the mineral space since 1986, but in the cobalt space since 2018. So we've been involved in a number of different projects, including a global consultation, international, but also in the Democratic Republic of Congo, on how to support artisanal miners to become formalized and for their cobalt to be accepted by the international market. And we're currently testing a hypothesis through research on whether or not enhancing women's security can actually be a means to reduce child labor. Like what are the links between the two, and essentially generating evidence to support or disprove that hypothesis. So just to say, we've been doing a lot of research, quantitative, qualitative, and practical implementation, and that's what I'm drawing from today. Excuse me. And so Kim already alluded to the DRC being a critical producer and trader in cobalt. It has the world's greatest cobalt reserves. It's estimated to produce 60 to 70% of the world's cobalt, 20 to 30% of which is artisanally mined. So that's to say, you know, groups are disorganized or informally organized. It's subsistence mining with very severely limited rights, harsh living conditions, working conditions, often low yields, etc. So very much kind of like the informal sector. But it's also, that sort of mining is also an important source of income for the local population. So what I want to speak to is some of the underlying systemic issues at a societal level that, when trying to source responsibly from cobalt, artisanal and medium and large scale mining, these are the issues that are coming up over and over again that are being skirted around a great deal. And you can kind of see where my thinking is going, perhaps, where unless we address these deep issues, very little or very little development or security, very few development or security dividends are actually going to be lasting or actually meaningful to the local population. So when I speak, I'll speak to each in turn very quickly. So land rights, this picture tells, 1,000, 1,000 stories. It very much underlines the importance of land to all of this, land tenure, land rights, land security, and how it can really be also a source of conflict. And so the two red stars are the two provincial capitals, and everything that you see that is kind of like an orange or purple is either a research permit or is an active exploitation by a large-scale mining company. So essentially the entire population is sitting on permits that actually belong to large-scale mining companies, and most of them foreign. So at some point, those populations will have to be moved. But when we talk about supporting artisanal miners or communities, they're not even on their own land to do that, and the possibility to support them to mine in a way that's legal and responsible and legitimate hardly exists, because the land and the permitting is just not there, or it's just not easily accessible to them. Food security, again, one of these structural kind of systemic issues that is linked to deep inequality and potential social conflict. Only 35% of respondents in two of the communities that we surveyed for a baseline study, 35% of respondents confirmed to be able to provide 2 meals per day, every day. So this really much stands in stark juxtaposition to shocking wealth, obviously being generated by some of these actors implicated in this trade, and presumably for state coffers as well. So food insecurity is absolutely a big priority for communities, but also one of these underlying conditions that is hardly addressed in any, I would say, interventions or discussions around responsible sourcing, responsible production and trade. Gender equality, again, it's through the same research that we were doing previously and the current research on women's security and child labor. Gender equality is well below the national averages across all indicators in this area of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So literacy rates, 32% for women, 86% for men, while the DRC national average is actually 66% for women. So we're an extremely, impoverished, but also illiterate population. Cell phone use, which is actually a well-known proxy indicator of vulnerability. Only 20% of women have a cell phone, when the national average for women is 74%. Financial inclusion, no women in these communities of the 150 or so we interviewed have essentially a bank account, and only 3% of men. Financial inclusion, only 3% of women and 4% of men have used mobile money, either have had experience or use it on a regular basis. The average monthly income by gender, men make in these communities, or those that responded or participated in the research, make $4.5 US a day, whereas women make $1.91 US per day. The minimum wage in DRC, and this is a bit shocking, is 84 cents US a day. So a lot of the discourse around responsible sourcing, responsible mining is actually latched on to minimum wage. But what we really need is a living wage, because minimum wage at 84 cents a day is not anything anybody can survive on. And just to keep in mind, and maybe another element of this discussion is about the population itself at the local level not having access to clean, safe, reliable energy. The vast majority just rely on handheld battery lamps in their homes, or battery charged lamps. So they themselves don't have access to safe, reliable energy. A lot of coal usage as well. A fourth key kind of systemic set of issues that need to be addressed if we're going to be really talking about, I think, a just transition and mitigating any sort of social risks, social conflict risks, is linked to transparency. So whether it's pricing, payments, contracts, and revenue. For pricing, artisanal miners need fair and transparent calculation of prices. Large and medium operations need to provide a living wage, as I mentioned. Clarity and transparency around the taxes, payments, fees paid, what is required at every part of the supply chain. It's very opaque. It's very disproportionate, and often the biggest burden, or the disproportionately biggest burden, falls on the smallest actor. Contract transparency, equally important, and revenue transparency. There's evidence of massive corruption in large-scale extractives in the DRC. And these are all hindering any sort of real beneficiation, but also clearly investment in development and security outcomes or benefits, and ultimately is a big source of societal disenfranchisement and instability. So some of the interventions currently around, at least in the last few years, around responsible sourcing, responsible mining, have really focused above all on assurance, traceability, due diligence, certification, the setting of standards that are often not really attainable in the context in which we're talking about. Mine safety, work conditions, child labor. So the interest, especially from the private sector actor downstream outside of the country, is, there's an interest in supporting change, but the investments are very much limited to things that are safe and not really about addressing underlying causes. So investments in, capacity building, health and safety training, education, vocational programming for young adults, a lot of charitable contributions. And really the dominant approach is one of risk mitigation and avoidance. And we've heard it in the introduction when Kim was speaking. The language of risk is one where those who we need to engage and invest for change are also too afraid to do so because of the inherent risks. But in order to change the situation and a lot of the underlying structural issues, that risk has to be essentially met halfway. There has to be engagement in order for there to be improvement. And so this has led, or the limitations of these interventions have led to disaffection, the concerns that things are top down, not inclusive, that we're not getting at underlying issues, not changing anything, and research fatigue as well, where the data itself is not serving communities. And I just listed there a bunch of quotes from some research carried out by IIED and AfriWatch, which speaks to a lot of these concerns and this local disaffection about the limitations of these interventions. And finally, this is my last slide. Ultimately, this speaks to entrenching inequalities. We're building something, we're trying to make sources of critical minerals clean without actually changing. Essentially, we're building it on the backs of these, the context of this deep inequality, which actually risks making it worse. At best, it will miss the mark and change is highly limited. At worst, we risk entrenching inequalities and fueling insecurity. So I will just leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joanne. You always do such a great job of painting the picture sort of from the ground up and what it looks like for artisanal miners and some of the challenges surrounding responsible sourcing. And I encourage anyone who hasn't seen Impact's research to look into that. It really has helped advance our understanding of what is happening in the sector. Thank you. And with that, I will pass it over to Mike.
Thanks a lot, Kim, and really great to be with everyone today. Huge appreciation also for all of those who are tuning in from Zurich. I know it's super late for you, so really glad to see everyone. Is my screen sharing properly, or is it showing up okay? All right. So I'm glad to be with you. Like Kim said during the introduction, I'm with Search for Common Ground. We're one of the world's largest conflict resolution organizations. And tend to make very, very long-term commitments to the places we work. We plan over a decade or more and work in conflict geographies across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, here in North America, where I'm based. I'm an American, and in Europe. And as we look at sort of this set of issues, I want to talk about two things. First, sort of why the peacebuilding community, and I see a number of us here from USAID to USIP to civil society groups and academics here in this group, why we ought to care and be smart about the issue that Kim laid out first and foremost. And then secondly, why the those involved on the industry side, and I see a couple of folks from the industry side here, ought to be thinking a little bit more strategically about engagement on the peace building side. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the metrics question, particularly to pick up maybe where Joanne left off at some of the sort of the stark inequalities and really the way that sort of the status quo is broken, and the way that Kim and laid out sort of how we might sort of start thinking in a different way. Search, we approach this issue as a peace building organization primarily because as we look across the societies that we care about, there are very few global industries that are as integrated into conflict affected and fragile states as the natural resource industry, and particularly the minerals economy and the green minerals economy, where we're looking at 500% growth. Companies with immovable supply chains are in one way or another embedded into the societies where the supply chains operate. And so it's important, we would argue, so from the green economic actors, that there are three reasons to focus. One is, of course, the supply chains don't move. And while innovation, recycling, things like that may mitigate some of the sourcing challenges, it's not going to mitigate all of them. And therefore, if you're in the green economy, the minerals economy, you're going to have a relationship with people who live in Peru, who live in Indonesia, Kazakhstan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Madagascar. And that's important for the corporation, fragile conflict-affected states. That's important to understand and engage with from a corporate perspective. Second is this question of risk management and scrutiny, ESG, and consumer demands for responsible sourcing. But most importantly, we're at what looks to me, at least, like a pretty broken and suboptimal status quo. And I think Joanne laid out some of the features, as did Moises earlier on, where responsible companies are not necessarily investing in some of the poorest communities on Earth because of the high perception and actual reality of risk. We're seeing technological innovation stunted by the perception of risk in investing in companies. If you look at sort of Nissan trying to engineer Congo out of its supply chain because they see Congo as so high risk that the Nissan Leaf can't use cobalt. Those are yielding sort of lose-lose scenarios, both for some of the societies as well as from an industry perspective. But most importantly, the degree to which sort of responsible business practices and responsible investments aren't being made in conflict-affected societies, it opens the door to sort of cowboys and less reputable, more risk tolerant cowboys, privately held companies, and other kinds of people who are engaged in sort of taking advantage of the natural resources boom. And so a status quo that right now is very much built around risk, very much built as well around sort of a do no harm approach, isn't serving what we want. I say do no harm because the primary driver of accountability is between often downstream companies, the manufacturers and so forth, sometimes the upstream companies, and Western publics, consumers, and investors, with an eye to sort of mitigating against any kind of particular UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, abuse or violation of UN guiding principles in the international eye, rather than holding themselves accountable and holding a project and measuring the performance of a project vis-a-vis the affected communities and community aspirations for development and good performance. At the same time, from a peace building perspective, although as Moises highlighted, there are projects that communities and most affected societies feel like should not go forward, the vast majority of conflicts emerge around the question of how projects go forward, who participates, who benefits, how they benefit. And fundamentally, this is in a lot of ways one of the most important challenges for societies, mineral societies where the land is rich but the people are poor. Because what's at stake is how communities in rural Congo or in southern Madagascar participate in the next industrial revolution. And I would submit that governments and publics that benefited from the previous industrial revolutions to the exploitation of those living in conflict and colonized and otherwise conflict-affected fragile places have a particular opportunity to ensure that not only do we not repeat the mistakes of past sort of scrambles for natural resources and past industrial revolutions, but actually use this opportunity and growth to yield sort of a better social outcome for both Western and developed societies, as well as the developing world, and in particular conflict states. The second key element, I think, that makes a peace building approach particularly relevant is the degree to which every one of these conflicts, particularly when you get down to, say, Joanne was talking about sort of ASSM communities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the management of concessions, the management of conflicts are inherently multi-stakeholder, and within every category of stakeholder, multiple levels. So from where every party is in one way or another, regardless of their true position of power, feels in one way or another exposed to the other. Companies between sort of the upstream, companies who are the upstream producers vis-a-vis the downstream, vis-a-vis downstream and midstream sort of smelters, all have their own sets of interest, capacities, challenges, risk exposures to the public, to government regulators. On the government side, both the international governments, the host governments of many of these companies, such as the U.S., as well as local government, national government, local government, each have a set of interests, capacities to bring to bear, and on the civil society side, from consumer-facing groups in the developed world to international civil society to local community institutions, and all of these sort of complex multi-stakeholder processes are fundamentally the only way of playing the strengths and capacities of each set of actors. Is really the only way that we can see sort of a social compact around the question of de-risking, around the question of enabling a different kind of framework. And then finally, to the degree to which conflicts in Latin America or in Indonesia are fundamentally exacerbated, let's say, by real material need, this investment is an opportunity to address some of the material scarcity that underpins a lot of the conflicts that the peacebuilding community cares about. And this means necessarily moving beyond. So if child labor is horrendous, something that we absolutely want to keep out of supply chains. At the same time, in a context like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 40% of children, 42% of children are stunted, have their growth stunted by hunger, as Joanne says, it's impossible to sort of take a human rights protecting, de-risking approach exclusively on the labor front without acknowledging and addressing some of the deeper challenges. And that's the only kind of thing that can be addressed with a multi-stakeholder response. There's been a proliferation from the industry side, a proliferation of kinds of standards. I think the Responsible Minerals Initiative is one, and the Better Cobalt Initiative, which people have referred to. There are a number of different kinds of things coming, particularly out of the industry. But I would argue that the emergent regime around the governance of these resources, particularly where they're sourced for high conflict and high poor places, would benefit from three sort of major changes. The first is around a shift from purely a do no harm risk mitigation approach to a do more good approach that looks at the social benefit around projects and in balance with the risks and harms and trade-offs that are done in a way. We've seen that in other kinds of industries that are high value, consumer facing, and human rights sensitive, for example, chocolate, coffee, the fair trade movement. We've also seen these kinds of social benefits and conflict benefits approaches to some of the infrastructure projects being developed by humanitarian agencies. So really an approach that looks at how investments and external injection of resources not only sort of mitigates harm, but asks the question not how can we get this stuff out of the ground and hurt the least people while we do it, but rather how does this project go forward and improve the ecosystem in which it operates. That's the kind of approach I think that also addresses some of the challenges where responsible cobalt sourcing from one tech company is simply about how you buy the best fruit from a poisoned tree. As long as the tree is poisoned, no matter how well you safeguard the individual apple you're buying from it, doesn't necessarily resolve the underlying problem, the underlying injustices, but also doesn't really materially advance yourself and your industry in the eyes of the consumer. Secondly, secondly, we look at, if you look at the various sort of standards that exist in the space, it's very much focused on sort of measuring change at a project level, and very little integration between sort of the investments being made by a project, by whether ASM or LSM project, and what are the system level impacts? How does that tie up to the UN SDGs? How does it tie up to the wide set of other kinds of interventions going in that region on one hand, and on the other hand, how are we bent and in a way that's aggregable, so that a company, so that a Glencore or a Trafigura or whoever is doing the sourcing is reporting against their net contributions to some of the global targets on one hand at an aggregate level, while at the same time also having better community benchmarking beyond sort of the mere charity, the centrally directed charity, build a school, build this, but is really being held accountable to citizens' expectations of what social good looks like for them. And then finally, a discussion of change in the sectors is fundamentally not only about multi-stakeholder, but there's a question not only about the standards, but about the social compact, right? Like when the New York Times runs a bunch of scandalized reports over the sale of the Tenke Fugurume mine in Congo, and how that played out, that's not necessarily just about are the new operators adhering to the same due diligence perspective. It's also about sort of the social compact that the American consumer, as well as the Congolese public, expect these high value resources to generate. And so there needs to be a public conversation involving all of these sectors. I think we would submit, and we'll share this and perhaps get into it in Q&A, because I know we have a wealth of people and expertise in this room. But I think that there are really 5 ways that we should be thinking about how we benchmark the positive contributions of external investment in green minerals in conflict-affected societies. And that is, 1, tracking the degree to which violence in communities and safety improves or decreases from the eyes of community members, tying it to SDG 16. 2, looking at the degree of inequality, social inequality. Often there's cases of sexually and gender-based violence, inequality in terms of those benefiting from a project based on their ethnic or whatever, within a community, about who benefits, who doesn't benefit, of everyone who shares the same geography landscape. And so what degree are we taking into account the whole of a community's life in addressing pre-existing inequalities? 3rd, the legitimacy and transparency of how decisions are taken, both by local government, often of whom are receiving windfall payments from projects, but also from the corporate entities. 4th, the question of agency. To what degree do individuals see the project expanding their opportunities in societies where, in contexts where opportunities are extremely limited and closed off? To what extent is the process of investing, the process also of having these kind of corporate CSR type practices, expanding people's own sense of agency? And finally, tracking investment in risk management as an entire category, looking not only at sort of the community development budget that a project might have, but balancing that with sort of all of the money spent on human rights compliance, due diligence, the security budget, and all of those things that are fundamentally about managing the long-term relationship that an actor in the green economy has with its supplier communities. So maybe I'll stop there. I think I'm happy to share a couple of the different kinds of lessons maybe in the Q&A, and really looking forward to this conversation. And deep thanks to you, Kim, and USAID for pulling this together, as well as the MPACs people for hosting us. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Mike. I really appreciate it. That was quite insightful and interesting to see some of the terminology that you're using too. I think some of that is going to be helpful for this conversation as well. And without further ado, I'd actually like to just pass it right along to Benjamin, to Professor Spatz. Ben. I'm going to introduce all your titles all at once. To close us out.
Wonderful, thanks. And I'll be as quick as possible so we can get into the Q&A. So hi everyone, and thanks. It's always fun going last, by the way, because I I can figure out how my remarks fit in with everyone else's. And, you know, that can be a problem if everyone already makes the points that you're going to make, but this is such a complimentary panel. It's really nice. And so what I'll say in framing is, first, that I think we heard really important comments from the three folks who spoke first, you know, about what's happening in relation to this certain type of peace building focus, in relation to communities, in relation to what a potential low carbon future and a green energy transition looks like, and why it's so important to think about peace building. So Moises was talking about, you know, the community and local strategies, rejection and redistribution, what that might mean. You know, Joanne was really giving this great set of systemic factors of how they're disconnected from, you know, these communities that are disconnected from the center, and the problem that has multi dimensions. And then Mike as well, both focusing on the benchmarks, but really like focusing in on the question of why peace building matters in this context. So, and both of those, you know, all three of you were speaking about this at the local level, and I'm going to kind of complement that a little bit by thinking, recognizing the full, complete importance of all of the things that are happening at the local and community level, but try to shine a light on what also happens at the high politics level, the really highest elite level of politics in fragile and conflict affected states, and what that means, and try to understand how, I would argue, you know, we don't only need to think about peace building, we also need to think about politics in relation to moving towards this future that we all know will happen and are pushing towards in our various ways. So yeah, I'm going to talk about political risks, politics, and what the politics are as we transition to this low carbon green energy economy. And often, not among so many informed people on this kind of a call, but you know, often the dialogue around a green energy economy or a low carbon future is that that's going to be good for the environment, it's going to be good for everyone, all good things go together. And you know, as soon as we get rid of hydrocarbons, for example, you know, world peace is right behind. It's, you know, it's all good things go together kind of trajectory. And you know, we've seen from the earlier presentations that that's not true. It's really not true, and that might be globally good, but there are these specific effects, country-specific effects, community-specific effects that are really important to understand. So I'll just quickly talk a little bit about some of the research that myself and my colleagues have been working on, funded by USIP. And as a plug, we'll be discussing more of this tomorrow morning, my time, I think tomorrow afternoon in Geneva. So what our research does in this project on decarbonization, what it does is we look at Sudan, South Sudan, Iraq, Nigeria, Venezuela, and Ecuador, and we try to understand what happens in these contexts when all of a sudden hydrocarbons, you know, either the prices fell or the production fell. And the reason that this is useful in the context of this other mineral you know, minerals are the new carbon kind of conversation is I think that there's lessons to be learned about the political connections and the political implications of a move away from hydrocarbons in relation to these minerals. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Well, we're going to focus primarily on the issue of revenue and revenue to the government, revenue to elites. This is where I think the kind of our theoretical lens begins. And the revenue is our starting point, is recognizing that in many fragile and conflict affected states, the revenue from oil and gas, similarly to minerals and other pieces, these come into government coffers, often are quite unaccountable, and then end up becoming what we call a political budget, sort of these really unaccountable pots of money that can be drawn upon by political leaders, usually through corruption or non-fully transparent or accountable mechanisms. This can be drawn upon by elite actors to pay off competitors, pay off allies, keep people on side. It can also be used to buy weapons and do all of these things that are needed at that political level. So when we're thinking about the revenue I mean, there's this really hard, uncomfortable political reality that's at the center of certain types of extractives. And again, I don't think that's too controversial among this group. And we see it time and time again. It's not geographic dependent. This is across the world. And then, so we really need to ask the question, you know, what is the purpose of revenue in these settings? And whether it's, again, oil and gas or any other kind of mineral, what we see time and time again is that the purpose of this revenue is not to provide public goods and services for communities and populations. It is not to enhance livelihoods of citizens, for the most part. It might happen also, but that's not the primary use of this money in many cases. It's often to be used for these types of political intra-elite deals. And so the reason that that's important is as follows. And because when we're thinking of fragile and conflict affected states, and we can also slightly rephrase what that means. I mean, these are states where formal institutions of government don't work in the way that they would in, you know, let's say a Western context. This is where transactions, deals among individuals, these transactions dominate formal institutions. You know, the laws and regulations are secondary, right? Okay, so again, what that means, and we see this time and time again, all the examples from Congo and other examples that you were just describing. I mean, this is where there might be elections or accountability institutions, but what you see, you know, in the presentations that came first is that there isn't that kind of accountability. Okay, so this is the kind of systems we're talking about. If that's the lay of the land for most of these elite actors and these types of elite political systems, how does this relate to what happens when there's, let's say, either a dramatic drop in the price of oil, or if at one point in the future, because hydrocarbons are a finite resource, once they go away altogether. And this is what we looked at in those cases. What we find, just to again put a finer point on it, I mean, in two of our cases, South Sudan and Iraq, as well as many of the others, the governments in those countries get over 90% of their budget from hydrocarbons. And most of that money is then distributed out in patronage payments and ways to kind of paper over these divisions and keep the coalitions together, often in quite explicit ways, especially in Iraq. So when that money dries up, what do we see? And we were able to look at these different 6 countries in pretty particular granular ways. I can discuss them all in the Q&A if we want. But here, there's essentially 3 things that we see when what we call traumatic decarbonization happens, when there's a rapid, unplanned reduction in revenue at the central level. And again, I think there's ways to think that that might be similar in the future, or at least these are risks. So what are the 3 things we see? We see dramatic political disruption. Elite deals break down. So the elite pact, where the leader at the center has balanced to the sectarian government in Iraq in a very careful and skillful way, or in Nigeria, balancing different individuals for ways that are often very hard for outsiders to understand, through positions in government or under the table payments, involvement in companies, etc. When the money dries up, these elite deals break down. And there's incredibly intense political jockeying. And that often, this goes to the second point, can result in violence. And that's what we saw in the case of South Sudan, where the South Sudanese turned off their oil spigot, and then their revenue went essentially to zero. The deals could not hold in Juba, and essentially that helped pave the way for the renewed civil war there. These are issues that we see time and time again. I'm not saying that there's always going to be violence, but when these elite deals break down, all sorts of things happen. Again, we're talking about countries that are fragile and conflict affected. So it's not necessarily that decarbonization is the trigger, but it will be present often. And the third thing that we see is that there's always a substitution effect, right? The folks at the center, they need to get their money from somewhere. And if it's not from hydrocarbons or minerals in some way, they will seek other ways to get money. And from our cases, we see that this is sometimes renting out armies to neighbors, renting out militias to faraway conflicts, which has knock-on and regional and global impacts. It can be relying on other minerals, which can have new exploitative implications, or similarly moving to the, let's say, reliance on external patrons. And that also, reconfigures politics in ways that can be, certainly difficult to foresee. So with that, just to wrap up, let me also say what we do not see in these issues of traumatic decarbonization. What you do not find. You do not find that the rules of the political game change. These countries do not transition, they don't lose their hydrocarbon revenue and then transition to democracies. That does not happen. It does not move in a positive direction in that case. The objectives of the political elites at the center, the need to have money in their political budgets, does not change. Simply the tactics to obtain that money changes. And in this regard, just the very last point is echoing so much of what my colleagues have already said. I mean, this is a broader takeaway, is that when we're thinking of risks, I mean, there are multiple. They happen at the local level, community level, all the way up. And I would urge, and our research suggests, that many of the challenges to moving to a low carbon future and a green energy economy are not purely technical. They are also not purely about environmental factors at all. Those two elements are there, but not fully. They are fundamentally political in nature, many of these challenges. And recognizing and putting that political lens on it is something that, in relation to a broader peace building lens, is going to be useful as we all think about how this project moves forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ben. I know I've already learned a great deal. Just a couple of very quick reflections from me. It does seem like a transition of this nature. It is sort of a fundamental shift in our economy, and we need to be thinking about the risks and the challenges and what it means as impacts on the ground. At the same time, I am heartened and reminded of all of a rich set of literature and lessons learned and tools that we do have already to think about and to address some of these issues. So from how we conceptualize the issues of sort of extractive industries and how that could relate to conflict, those are going to be helpful constructs in when we're thinking about transitioning to a low carbon future. Other sorts of constructs are going to be thinking about political economy and what it means for oil producing countries. I think all of that is going to be very helpful. And we have this set of tools from the peace building and the peace building community that are going to be quite valuable to us. So I am sort of heartened that we do have a rich set of literature and tools to draw on as sort of we move forward. I would like to transition now to the discussion part of this session. And so please start entering in any questions you have into the chat box. I do know that we have a lot of really interesting people in the room. I saw people from civil society around the world, and including I think Democratic Republic of Congo. I saw folks from private sector on the line, and from World Bank and U.S. Institute of Peace and the Wilson Center and others. So please, we have a lot of expertise in the room. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We are going to try to put people on, select a few people to put on mic and to make it a little bit more interactive. So we may come back to your question to see whether you will be willing to be on video or not. But first, we have a discussant, Kendra Dupuy, who has kindly agreed to kick us off. Over to you, Kendra.
Great. So I think I will just echo what Kim said here to keep it brief, because I know we're running out of time, and that just a couple of reflections here. So first of all, we know that, or at least what's projected in terms of mining for key mineral inputs, mineral and metal inputs into green technology. So those projections are really estimating a massive scale up in mining. So this is a problem that an issue that we really need to take seriously, because much of this mining will take place in, continue to take place in poor and vulnerable places, for instance, in Africa. So in many ways, what we're facing is, I think what Kim just pointed out, it's an old problem. These issues are not new, but we're entering into a new economic dynamic and new sectors. So we're also looking at, a combination of minerals and long value chains going into products, which consumers may not always understand the kind of direct relation between mining for these critical minerals and the types of abuses going on. So I guess what I would just say is that, there's a need here, like Kim pointed out, to carry forward the old knowledge and tools that we have generated in an earlier time point, and to try to learn and remember those lessons and bring them forward in this new energy transition. And I think the question here, if I'm going to throw one out here to our panelists and to our audience, is, how do we really increase demand for fairly and justly mined inputs into green technology outputs, green technology, into the green technology revolution here. So I'll conclude with that. Thanks a lot.
Do any of our panelists want to take a stab at Kendra's question?
I'll go. I'll start, I guess. So in terms of demand for what I'm assuming what is being implied here is responsibly sourced minerals and metals for more responsible consumption, essentially. And I think the demand has increased manyfold. I think there's actually quite a lot of demand. I think companies, especially in the critical mineral space, are jockeying to position themselves to assure they have access, because the demand is growing and interest is increasing. I think the challenge is at the moment, actually, from a practitioner level at the field, working with civil society and relevant stakeholders, is that demand also comes with expectations that are actually quite unrealistic at times. So, in the gold sector, as well as cobalt, it's like it has to be green. It has to be, all the SDGs have to be hit. It has to be it has to be perfect. It has to be perfectly mined and traded. And that is not the starting point. And so how do we work with miners? And I'm talking here about artisanal miners in particular. How do we work with them to meet them halfway? Because if the bar is too high, the vast majority are not going to be able to realize the standards that are being expected of them, and then be excluded out of the market, which will only be more harmful. So there's a bit of a conundrum there, a paradox, where demand is actually increasing, but as demand and as attention and awareness about these issues increase, the standards keep going higher and higher. So the actual realizations of those standards on the ground are actually getting more complicated and more difficult. And Mike alluded to, there's multiple sets of standards, and it's become like standard soup. It's become a lot more confusing, and especially for the communities on the ground. So personally, I don't think demand is is in want at the moment. I think it's actually, how do we respond to demand in a way that brings everybody on board, rather than just a select few and essentially leaving everybody behind and just creating islands of responsibility. We want everybody to benefit, because there will always be a market, right? So they'll be selling, but who they sell to, whether, we want to guide them towards responsible trade, but perhaps if they're closed out of that, they'll continue selling to a different market that doesn't have those standards.
Thank you, Joanne. And definitely, it's not the first time we've heard today the point about a proliferation of standards, if I can say it. I'll turn it over to Moises.
Yes, so I guess one new thing that I will point out, at least for Latin America, is that, in the old days, like if you think about the early development of mining, right? I think about Peru, I think about the highlands, there were three major American corporations show, right? But if you look at Latin America, I mean, there's just an abundance of joint ventures, right? So foreign capital, national capital, and this goes back to Benjamin's point, right? That in a way, can you still hear me? This is so the origin of the company is not what it used to be, right? It's just different. There's just a lot more actors involved, right? And also, okay, thinking about Latin America, I mean, the new development would be to think about the dragon in the room, right? China, right? So again, that's new. That's not something that we have seen, in recent years. So I'll just add that.
Thank you for that. And I would like to, I'm wondering if Sharon, if you would be willing to ask your question on camera. I thought it would be interesting. It might bring in some of the sort of geopolitical elements into the conversation.
Oh, sure, Kim. And I'm just a little casual, but that's the beauty of virtual conferences. I had two questions, and the first one for you, which may be about internal deliberations and you're not able to answer, but there's a lot of activity in the U.S. government on critical minerals and within the administration. And I was just wondering if you feel like green minerals is fully integrated into that conversation. So that was one question. And then the second question was, it would be really interesting to hear this panel, and we've just already had the first salvo in this, talk about China in the green mineral space, given that they're a major producer, a major consumer, the major processor, and also a major global investor in almost all the places where there's production, whether it's Congo or Brazil, DRC or Brazil or you name it. So it would be really interesting to hear the panelists talk about the role of China here and whether they can play a helpful role.
Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate the question. I can try to take the first part, and then maybe I'll, if Joanne doesn't mind, maybe I'll pass over at least the first part of the second question to Joanne, and then others as they see fit. But for the first question, in terms of the U.S. government and the critical minerals conversations and green energy minerals conversations, certainly both of those are being discussed quite robustly within the U.S. government. Certainly the White House and the National Security Council have consistently sent out some policy messages that we need to be paying attention to critical minerals. There was the White House released a 100-day review of critical minerals that highlighted a number of things, sort of including a need for, an increased, steady and sustainable supply chains for critical minerals. Importantly, to do two things, among others, but it did highlight the need to have these secure supply chains to meet our climate goals. And so when so there is that linkage between critical minerals and green energy minerals in that document. And it also highlighted, I think importantly, the need for supply chains to be consistent with America's labor, environment, equity, and other values. So the importance of responsible supply chains as well. So not just reliable, but really responsible ones that reflect our values. I will also note that if anyone saw USAID's draft climate strategy that was released for public comment, it did include some language around green energy minerals as well. So I do think that it's starting to get some really robust attention within the US government. As for your second question on the role of China and responsible sourcing, I'd like to pass it over, if you don't mind, to maybe to Joanne, and then others can chime in as they'd like.
Yeah, okay, I'll give it a shot. It's more of an observation than anything, I guess. I mean, our organization and myself have been working in a number of different international fora around responsible mineral trade for the last dozen or so years at the OECD and a number of other initiatives. And I think it's safe to say that especially in the cobalt space, the Chinese have been at the table, and there is more conversation than there's been previously, certainly, for example, around gold or other minerals where we've tried to engage the Chinese. And I think there are some very large public-facing companies that obviously transnational that I think play a role in bringing these different kind of geopolitical blocks together. Now, I don't know, I'm not going to look in a crystal ball and say how successful it's going to be to everybody find a common ground, but there is a lot more conversation and dialogue, at least when it comes to cobalt, which is what I know, than I've seen in other sectors. And so there's a Responsible Cobalt Initiative, which is a supposedly Chinese initiative, Responsible Minerals Initiative, which is European and North American largely, but the membership crosses over. And so there's this kind of dialogue that has to happen and attempts at coordination, but there's a lot of barriers, of course, and I think a lot of learning going on. But I would say on a positive spin, there's dialogue happening and attempts at coordination and engagement, but I don't know the extent to which that's going to, what's going to come out of that specifically.
Great, thank you. And I'm not so far seeing any other takers on Sharon's question. So I think next, if we could, I think we had an interesting question here from Kelsey. I'm losing your last name right now. Okay, there it is, Kelsey Coolidge. And I'm wondering, Kelsey, would you feel comfortable coming on video to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, I think if it's all right, I might just stay on audio if that works for you all. Can you hear me?
That's perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I think, my question was more kind of sort of thinking on a really kind of a broader level that, this demand for green minerals comes from these very rich countries who are driving climate change. And so I'm curious for the panelists, is the problem with mining simply that it sometimes takes place in contexts that we identify as fragile or conflict affected? Is there a greater responsibility that rich countries have to play here? And then even just sort of like the deeper question here of, can we really sort of say economic growth is a value here when we have this sort of huge challenge of climate change? Is there a compatibility between valuing economic growth and also mitigating climate change? So yeah, thank you for calling me in.
Thank you, Kelsey. So your question about economic growth and the links to valuing economic growth and addressing some climate change issues and some north-south issues, it looks like Mike has raised his hands to give that a shot. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's absolutely a question of global justice and equity. I think climate is one lens. I think the other lens to look at, like I said in the presentation, is, if this is the next industrial revolution, it's a chance to repair some of the harms and the exploitation of past industrial revolutions. If the copper that fueled the electrification of Europe came from Africa, if the uranium that fueled the nuclear age came from Africa, I think that there's a moment to think about it in that sort of historical justice perspective as well. What I would want to highlight is, I think, at least, we at Search are thinking about this in the natural resources space writ large, and I think some of the same kinds of conversations we're having here today about how communities benefit from sort of the green transformation of the world should also be extended to some of like the question about conservation and regreening and conservation of forests. If we look at sort of where a lot of the promising hydrogen power projects might be considered, those are, again, some of these questions. So I would say, I think it's very much worth looking at sort of all of the, expanding beyond just minerals, and thinking about how communities most affected benefit from the revolution, the industrial revolution that's coming writ large. But I very much support that kind of equity lens, or justice lens, rather.
Yeah, and looking into the questions of equity and justice, I was wondering, Professor Arce, if you had anything you'd like to add.
I think just to finish, it's sort of like we're at this critical moment, right? Where going back to Benjamin's point, for a lot of these developing countries that are blessed with resources, right? The way to grow to the economy is by exploiting or, selling those resources, right? But at the same time, I think one thing that has happened is that with new technologies, a lot of these new energy discoveries have moved closer to urban areas or agricultural valleys, right? So there's obviously a tension with existing population. So the question is, how do you navigate both, right? The new technologies that are discovering resources closer to populated areas, but at the same time, the need of developing countries in the global south to sell those resources, right? And how can you if you want to call it a broad outcome, right, that will benefit lots of population, as opposed to just a narrow sector of the government.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It looks like we are about at the end of the time today. I feel free to continue to chat in the chat box for the last couple minutes if you'd like to. We're not going to be able to take any more questions just because of time. This is such an important issue. It's going to continue to be an important issue. And I think we're just at the early phases of finding solutions and talking about these critical issues of transitioning to a low carbon future and what that means in terms of some of the inputs into those renewable energy technologies, what that means as Professor Spatz brought up, what that means for oil producing countries, as well as what that means for resource rich developing countries. And because I think the bottom line is this is a fundamental shift in our energy systems, and it will have pretty significant implications on a lot of our work in the development sector, on a lot of our work in the peace building sector, and looking at conflict, whether you're sitting in academia or whether you're on the ground in the, implementing programs in the DRC or Colombia or Peru, or it doesn't really matter where you're sitting. I think a lot of us are going to be having to deal with these issues. Certainly the private sector is dealing with these issues. And I think I see this as just the beginning of the conversation. And I do think it's important for all of us to put our heads together and come to the table with tools and ideas and frameworks to continue to think about how to best address these really challenging and important issues. So I thank everyone for your time. Certainly all of our esteemed panelists, thank you for joining us, as well as everyone who called in. I know people are calling in from around the world, and it is late in some places and early in some places and inconvenient hours. So thank you for joining us. Really appreciate everyone's time on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.